Has anybody ever ended a talk or a speech in a way that they were proud of, that they thought worked well? I mean, the idea here being that when you're done and you walk out of the room, is anybody going to remember it 5 minutes from now? And that's a tall order. It's a tough order when we're listening to messages all the time. But you want to be the person that people remember when you walk out of a room. That they go home that night and say, I heard so-and-so talked about this, and it really stuck with me.
Well, I think some people clap at the end, some not, so I don't
Depends if they were friend or foe, right?
Yeah, I don't know. I'll have to think about that.
Is the end of the message what you're saying that will stick to people?
Yeah, I think you have to have a residual message. Yeah, it's got to resonate, and it's got to stick with people, and not just be in one ear and out the other. And we've all sat through things, and a lot of times, someone will give a speech and they talked about 5 or 6 things, and then you walk out of the room and you may know the topic, but nothing has really stuck with you. So figuring out how to end with an exclamation point where people will remember it and know what you talked about, and then it sticks with them. So these are just some suggestions, some options. In a perfect world, we would all make a dramatic statement. We would, in the business, we call it waxing poetic. So we've got this beautiful last line that we just know is fantastic. It's coming together. It sounds exactly the way we want it to. It's poetic. We know it works. Now, 90% of the time, that does not come to us, right? In a perfect world, it would come to us. So we can't rely on that. Either that happens or it doesn't. But you can fake it in some ways. Sometimes you can end with a quotation. Talk about a testimony, something somebody else said, as so-and-so once said. Now, the key there is, though, that quotation has got to relate to what you were talking about. It can't just be a cool quotation on the topic, which is what we often hear, as Dr. Martin Luther King always said, or as Ronald Reagan always said, or as, as playwright, blah, 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 always said. And then, it's a great quote, but you have no idea what the meaning is or how this relates back. So I think you got to walk the steps. You got to connect the dots for people. If you're going to use a quotation, there's got to be, you've got to relate that back to what that thesis or central idea is, or else it's just kind of out there and it doesn't make the impact. And I think that's what a lot of people make when they use a quotation, is it sounds all great, but what does that really mean? How does it relate? So you connect the dots back. The other thing you can do, this is what I like to do, this is my cheat for how and I do this in my writing and also, in speaking, but often when I was writing a story, is I would play off some great final quotation. So if I interviewed you and I said, what do you love best about your job?
Contact with the people. Working with the people. People
who mean so much to him, Or you play off a verb, so to speak. If I said to you, what stands out to you as the greatest component of your job?
Communication, probably.
And then I would play off the word, communication. I'd say communication in a way that makes impact with others. You know what I mean? So I would play off of some word in the sentence, whether it was a strong verb or a noun or an adjective, or if I said to you, what are your future, tell me what your future goals are.
My future goals in my job?
Sure, why not, in anything.
Future goals in my job, we maintain our community hospital, that we recruit industry, and that we enhance the quality of life of our citizens.
A life that will hopefully, a life devoted to helping the lives of others. You know what I mean? So I pull off some word in that sentence or in that quote, and I play off of it. It makes me sound like I'm a great writer or poet, but really what I've done is I've cheated and I've taken something out of that final quote or statement and I've played off of that. So that's another way for you to work off that and to end that. But there's nothing wrong with ending with a quotation. I mean, 60 Minutes does it every week, but it's got to be one that people easily understand and understand the impact and the connection with that. So you can play off a quotation. I also like referring back to the introduction. So if you started with a story, and he was talking about, using the pitcher and the glass and beginning with that, and then ending with that as well to bring it full circle. So if you've talked about Mary Jo and her struggle to find health care, then you brought it full circle back to Mary Jo. Or if you talked about a scenario, this would be, the nightmare we could face. Well, imagine a world where we fix the problem in this way and we brought it back. So there's that sense of closure, bringing it all back to the beginning. And usually, when I would interview people for a story, I would think about, listening to what their responses would be. I would right away hear a quote or something that they said that I knew I wanted to start with and something I wanted to finish with. And similarly, you want to be able to have that parallel. So, in figuring out how you're starting and ending something, bringing it all back full circle is another way to give power to what you're writing. And then there's always the future action. Okay, these are the steps we need to take. This is the next thing we need to do. If we want to make this happen, this is what's next. Or a call to action to the community. If this is something that you support, you need to go to this website, or you need to show up to this meeting, or you need to sign this petition. So give people something to look ahead, so to speak. But I think there has to be, you should never end a talk or a speech or a presentation and people are wondering whether or not this is the end. We've all read books or seen movies like that. We're like, oh, that's it? Done? Well, wasn't ready for that. So I think you have to warm people up. You have to let them know. You have to use words that let them know that you're coming to an end. And they could be something as simple as, finally, as we've been talking about for the last few minutes, as I've said, to wrap this up, so people know it's coming. Because usually when they hear a word like that, all of a sudden they start paying attention again. Because they know the end's coming. Oh, I better listen up because the crux of what he's talking about, he or she, they're about to recap this. They're about to reiterate this. We're about to get to the real point of what this is. So you've got to give people that sense.
That's what I usually, sometimes I say the challenge is to you.
Right.
And then that's really respect to them, that's what they've got to do nothing.
Right, and that's a call to action. I mean, a lot of times we refer to Monroe's motivated sequence, where you tell people why why something needs to be done, right? So you explain to them why it needs to be done. And then you go to, okay, this is how I propose we do it. If we do it this way, this is how things would look, and here's what you need to do in order to make it happen. So you walk them through those steps. But first you got to convince them that there's a need there, that there's some reason why we've got to do it. And that goes back to, in the introduction, I think, stating the importance of the topic or startling them in some way or beginning with that anecdote that's going to let them know why they should be paying attention to you and why this matters. And then you can go ahead and articulate what your vision is for fixing it or what needs to be done or how you need to go about it. And then at the end, you can have that future call to action, or you can bring it full circle, or you can tell them what the next steps are, or however it is. But you got to walk them through it that way. And I do think letting people know that you're about to wrap up is a cue for them to pay attention, even if they've zoned out at that particular point, that they know that, okay, this is an end that's coming. Similarly, in terms of your language, just some things to think about. And I don't think, like I said, once you know what you're going to discuss, once you've planned it out and really thought about how you're going to go about it, this is some tweaking to just bring your public speaking and your speech writing to the next level. We're a society of rule of threes. So it's a bird, it's a plane, it's Superman. 3 little pigs, 3 bears. We think of things in threes. So if you're going to provide a list for people, you want to do it in threes. If you're discussing something, or you're thinking about having a list or making a statement of something, think about doing it in threes. It's just lyrical, it sounds better, and it makes more of an impact. Parallelism, all right? Using words, and it's repetition, but repetition for the sake of making an impact on something. So if you think about of the people, by the people, for the people, that's an example of parallelism. So it's repetition for a purpose in some kind of way. So, I'm a citizen, I'm a woman, so the same construction, and figuring out how to repeat that construction, sometimes doing that and carrying that through is a very effective way of making an impact with words. And then there's the concept of inversion, right? Taking words and switching them in an unexpected way or turning a sentence around. It just makes a sentence sound like it has more impact. So I used in the beginning the example of ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. And that line was played around with a little bit. I mean, that was kind of a last minute tweak to switch that around and switch around the construction of those words. But that's why we remember it. And that's why it's a famous quotation. Another example also from Kennedy is, let us never negotiate out of fear, but let us never fear to negotiate. So taking a sentence that you have and then switching it around, it just gives it that extra power and punch. So playing around with some of those techniques a little bit can be helpful as well. Connectives, I mentioned those. Those are very important when you're speaking. People need to be able to follow the roadmap, especially if you're going to run through a proposal or you're going to, you've got a series of points, letting people know where they are in the presentation. So those signposts like first, secondly, next, finally, as we have seen, to wrap up, or giving people an internal preview. So far we've looked at this, now we're going to look at this. So people know where you're going. And it's funny because last night, my first grader, he said to me, he said, tomorrow in class, I'm going to have to construct a paper airplane. And then we were supposed to get up and we're supposed to explain how we did it to the class. We're going to have to do that. So I said, oh, great, Braden. So what are you going to, so I guess you're going to say that you fold the paper in half and then you fold the corners. And I was going on and on. He goes, no. He goes, Mommy, you have it all wrong. He goes, you have no transition. You need to say, first, I'm going to do this. Second, I'm going to do that. Third, I'm going to do this. And you got to run through the steps and let people know, last. And finally, because that's the whole point of the exercise, is letting people know where they're at in the process when it's a how-to. And so I think we need to cue people in terms of where we are in the process and link ideas together, or else you're just throwing out a series of information or facts, and people can't find it. So the idea is to be as clear as possible. Plus, when you're sitting in an audience, you want to know where you're at. You want to know this is wrapping up. You want to know we're in the middle. You want to know, how much or how many different factors are going to be discussed with something. How many points are going to be made. So the clearer you can be to your audience, the easier they're going to follow you, and the more they're going to be with you and get what you're talking about. So forcing yourself to do that. And that's why it's important to just keep things to a couple of ideas. You can't throw it all in there and keep it focused in that particular way. So as most of you, since you're in politics, it's all about the art of persuasion. And so in your speeches, in your talks, in whatever it is, you're trying to bring people around to your point of view, hopefully, right? That's what it's all about. And really, you need all three components that the Greeks talked about way back when, right? There's the logos, and that's your evidence and reasoning. We talked about that a little bit this morning. The idea that you've got to be able to rely on testimony and statistics and facts, and then once you've got that support, connect the dots. So many people love to throw out numbers or throw out evidence or quote things, but they don't connect the dots back to how does this relate to what I'm trying to tell you. And if you can't make the connection back, people aren't going to buy into it. They're not. So you can tell people that there is an unemployment rate of X, or that we need this much money, or people are saying there's a huge problem here. But then you've got to connect it back to what your plan is, to what that thesis is. So having that evidence and having that reasoning, that appeals to the logical part of the brain, and that's important. Then you've got that ethos, the competence and the character that we talked about, establishing that in your introduction. Now some of this you can control, and some of this you can't. Competence, I think you can articulate what your experience is and let people know why you have a connection and experience. I don't think, whatever your political leanings are, I don't think anybody could argue that Hillary Clinton was competent enough to do the job. She had a resume where, if you looked at her resume just as someone hiring her, you saw it was all there. But when it came to the character issue, that's where Trump kept trying to hit her on the character issue. Because the truth is you got to be able to have both. Now, you can control competence by the experience and things that you do. The character, you got to build that and rely on that. And sometimes, how many times did I hear people say, well, I don't want to vote for Trump, but I just can't vote for her. Heard that a lot. That went more to the character issue. Ideally, you want to have both. You want to build the expertise, and then in your actions and your deeds and your experience, build that character as well. So that's another component of persuasion. And sometimes, people just, they form impressions of people. You're not going to be able to get everybody, right? But you try to build that as you can. And the third part of this that you can't control is the pathos, right? The appealing to emotion. Because it doesn't matter how logical you are in your arguments. It doesn't matter how much evidence and reasoning and numbers you've got. If you don't connect with people on a one-to-one personal level, you're never going to get that support or be able to persuade people. So, and I think the way that you connect with the pathos, as he was saying, is you've got anecdotes, you've got examples. You can tell stories, you've got people who are specifically impacted by whatever it is. So, if I'm discussing in the news, a car accident that happened on the highway, I may say that two people were killed, but if I have visuals that show, shoes on the roadway, well, then we start to feel like there's a person there. So you've got to be able to figure out how am I going to appeal to hearts as well as minds? And you got to have both. Because some people are more swayed by emotion and some people are more swayed by logic. But let's face it, a lot of times, even though we logically know something, we still have to feel it in our gut. So you have to be able to find those anecdotes and those examples and tell them well, so that people make that connection to what the personal aspect is of what you're discussing, so to speak. So in essence, as you're constructing your speeches, you've got to figure out what your tone is, right? And that tone has got to be, and we'll look at an example in a minute from Ronald Reagan, but the tone has got to be appropriate to the occasion. Sorry, not me? Yeah. 13?
Matt Clark. Take your question.
So you've got to be able to, your tone has got to be appropriate to the occasion. You've got to know what you're dealing with. And obviously a tone is going to be different at a wedding than it is at a funeral, than it is at a hearing, than it is at a rally, than it is at a school board meeting. It's going to be different. So it's got to be appropriate to the occasion. Language. When you're figuring out what language you want to use, obviously it's got to be appropriate to the occasion. There's certain ways that you speak when you're in a small, group of friends or in a meeting of colleagues versus when you're in a larger arena. It's going to be different when it's a different demographic that you're speaking to, different geography, et cetera, et cetera. You have to determine that. It's also got to be appropriate for you. You have to be true to who you are and authentic with who you are. And so, you want to use words and phrases that fit your style and fit you. In terms of, political correctness, and I'm sure you guys deal with this every day, trying to figure out the appropriate way to talk about controversial topics. We live in an era where someone always has a phone, and someone could always be taping you. So, you never want to assume, you always want to assume that the mic is hot, so to speak. It used to be that, unless you were on television or in front of a camera, you knew when the mic was on and you knew when it wasn't. Nowadays, it is always on. We even had something in Louisville a few weeks ago where a student at Manual High School, a bunch of students at Manual High School were taping the principal when they were in his office. He had no idea he was being taped.
That's stupid.
You should always assume you're being taped, right? And the conversations, they were asking me this morning how many people have been quoted out of context. That a piece of a conversation could be taken and, thrown all over YouTube and social media, and it can be completely out of context. So you should always assume in the language that you're using and what you're saying that you could be taped on the phone, and that pieces of that could be packaged and put out online in media. And it doesn't have to be by sophisticated media outlets. It could be the average person, it could be your opponent, it could be someone who just doesn't like you, who's using what you said, in another way. So, it's hard. It's hard because, you want to say what you mean, but having to think about all the language that you use. In my experience, though, I think that if you think about what you're going to say, and at the forefront of your mind, you're asking yourself, how could this be taken, could this be taken in an inappropriate way or in a way that's going to get me in trouble? If you ask yourself those questions, you won't make mistakes. It's really when you're not thinking along those lines at all. So we can get really bogged down in terms of political correctness, but I think that if that's on our, if that's in our minds as we're speaking, and it's unfortunate because a lot of times we're speaking in the moment, we're speaking impromptu, and something doesn't come out quite the way we intended, or for an audience that we intended. But I think that if you have it in your mind at all times, that you're conscious of that we're in that environment, then you probably won't make those mistakes. But we have to be, we have to be conscious of that because, like I said, the whole context of what you said won't be played. It'll be whatever those few words are. They'll be played and played and played and replayed on social media. It used to be this was just a national issue or celebrity issue, but we now know, when you hit something on Facebook or Instagram or Twitter, they ask you, do you want to publish? Everybody's a publisher now. Everybody's a publisher. And I heard how many of you guys are up for re-election? Like, coming up, a lot of you, right? So, it's mean. I know I just went through a ruthless campaign with my dad, against, a lot of the incumbents were facing a lot of millennials for those spots. And they were taking to social media and using social media in all kinds of ways, in all kinds of sophisticated ways to try to unseat incumbents. And I think that you got to be savvy. You got to be savvy about what you're saying and what you're saying to whom and how you engage in that way. So language is important. And it used to be we were in an environment where something was said and then it passed and went away. Nothing ever goes away now. It's always there, and it's there to stay because it's on tape, and it's on tape on a phone. So it's just something to think about when you're speaking. And even if you think it's a closed group, and it's a group of allies, well, it's not. It's not. Even that quote-unquote closed-door meeting is not a closed-door meeting. So we have to be careful in terms of the language and the way that we go about it. And I think, rather than getting obsessive about it, again, if we're just conscious of that, then we probably will make the right choices in terms of the words we use and the way that we phrase things. We also have to consider, as you're putting together presentations and speeches, the situational factors, the settings of it. First of all, what time is it and when is this happening? Because there are certain times of day, you're going to a session that's the last session of the day, once that's done, you're out of here. So, there's a sense of anticipation there versus something first thing in the morning when you're fresh. So you got to know, are you standing between your audience and lunch? Are you standing in between your audience and getting out of here? Are people coming in and it's just kind of the start of the day? So what time are you approaching people? And then also the venue, where it is. Because I don't care how engaging you are, if the room is cramped and crowded, if it's cold, if it's inhospitable, if the chairs aren't comfortable, if people are jammed into a spot, that's going to affect how people receive your message. So those things are important. So when you're choosing locations to do things, think a lot about the location. Think about what time you want to go. Think about where in the order do you want to speak. You don't really want to be the last person on there. If you can kick off first, or figure out what the order is in which that goes, that may make a difference in terms of how people receive your message in that way. So let's take a look at an example, which I think is a perfect example of a construction of a speech in terms of tone, in terms of language, and many of you may have heard it. It's Ronald Reagan's speech after the Shuttle Challenger in 1986. That night, Reagan was supposed to deliver the State of the Union address. And so, as you all know, the State of the Union address, big pageantry, going before both houses of Congress, et cetera, et cetera. But in this case, his team very aptly realized that they couldn't go on with the State of the Union as it was. There was no way that he could go to the Capitol building. I mean, he could have. He could have gone to the Capitol building and addressed both houses of Congress and the nation in that same venue. But they thought about it, and they thought that those situational factors weren't going to work, that it wasn't the proper tone and the proper setting for that. And so they scrapped the entire State of the Union speech and instead crafted a much shorter speech that Reagan delivered from the Oval Office. So let's listen to that. And my apologies, there's a bit of a buzz in the audio.
I plan to speak to you tonight and report on the State of the Union. The events of earlier today have led me to change those plans. Today is a day for mourning and remembering. Nancy and I are pained to the core of the tragedy of the Shuttle Challenger. We know we share this pain, all the people of our country. This is truly a national loss. 19 years ago, almost to the day, we lost 3 astronauts in a terrible accident on the ground. But we've never lost an astronaut in flight. We've never had a tragedy like this. And perhaps we've forgotten the courage it took for the crew of the shuttle. But they, the Challenger 7, were aware of the dangers, but overcame them and did their jobs brilliantly. We mourn 7 heroes: Michael Smith, Dick Scobie, Judith Resnick, Ronald McNair, Ellison Onizuka, Gregory Jarvis, and Kristen Nicole. We mourn their loss as a nation together. The families of the 7, we cannot bear as you do the full impact of this tragedy. But we feel the loss, and we're thinking about you so very much. Your loved ones were daring and brave, and they had that special grace, that special spirit that says, give me a challenge, and I'll meet it with joy. They had a hunger to explore the universe and discover its truths. They wished to serve, and they did. They served all of us. We've grown used to wonders in this century. It's hard to dazzle us. But for 25 years, the United States space program has been doing just that. We've grown used to the idea of space, and perhaps we forget that we've only just begun. We're still pioneers. They, the members of the Challenger crew, were pioneers. And I want to say something to the school children of America who are watching the live coverage of the shuttle's takeoff. I know it's hard to understand, but painful things like this happen. It's all part of the process of exploration and discovery. It's all part of taking a chance and expanding man's horizons. The future doesn't belong to the faint-hearted. It belongs to the brave. The Challenger crew is pulling us into the future, and will continue to follow. I've always had great faith in and respect for our space program, and what happened today does nothing to diminish it. We don't hide our space program. We don't keep secrets and cover things up. We do it all up front and in public. That's the way freedom is, and we wouldn't change it for a minute. We'll continue our quest in space. There will be more shuttle flights and more shuttle crews, and yes, more volunteers, more civilians, more teachers in space. Nothing ends here. Our hopes and our journeys continue. I want to add that I wish I could talk to every man and woman who works for NASA or who worked on this mission. Tell them, your dedication and professionalism have moved and impressed us for decades, and we know your anguish. We share it. There's a coincidence today. On this day 390 years ago, the great explorer Sir Francis Drake died aboard ship off the coast of Panama. In his lifetime, the great frontiers were the oceans, and a historian later said he lived by the sea, died on it, and was buried in it. Well, today, we can say of the Challenger crew, their dedication was, like Drake's, complete. The crew of the Space Shuttle Challenger honored us for the manner in which they lived their lives. We will never forget them, nor the last time we saw them this morning, as they prepared for their journey and waved goodbye, and slipped the surly bonds of earth to touch the face of God. Thank you.
So reactions to that?
Very emotional for me, because I was at U of L finishing my degree. I just brings back so many memories. And I was in the library at U of L when that shuttle blew up. But anyway, yeah, the reaction for the speech is very touching, very emotional.
What works about it?
You can see the compassion that he had.
Yeah. I mean, there's definitely an authenticity there in terms of you know, we believe that he felt that emotion, right?
Yes.
We believe that, you know, that he's in mourning. I mean, he seems like, you know, someone who's in mourning that actually had a personal connection in that way. The tone, you know, is well set.
Like your dad or your grandfather talking to you.
Yeah.
You know, and you would sit and listen to them, just, because I wasn't as young as Melody, but, I mean, you just sit on the edge of your chair, wait for your grandpa or your dad to say something. It's the way he treated you.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously, the decision to put him to the compassion, you know, in his voice and his tone and his delivery, that's all there, so you've got to have that. The decision, though, you know, on the part of his staff to stick him at the desk, you know, just have it there in a simple kind of tone with no fanfare, you know, nobody clapping, none of the usual State of the Union pageantry in that type of way. Notice he's got various audiences that he's addressing here, because who's watching this? Who are the audiences that he's got to pay attention to here?
The families.
The families,
Students.
Organization.
students, NASA, right? And then internationally, don't forget, this is when, this is the height of the Cold War in some ways, so he's speaking also internationally to the Russians and others who may be thinking this is a glitch for the American space program. So, in many ways, this is a commemorative speech in a lot of ways. It's commemorating those astronauts. It's also a commemoration of the United States space program, all in one real speech. The astronauts become a microcosm for America's journey in space. Notice also, when he's talking about the crew, he says each of their names, right? So he's specific in terms of those individuals. He mentions them by name, and he says those names slowly, takes his time with them. So he's talking to the families. He talks to the school children, because everybody, if you remember correctly, and we were all watching this live as it went down. This was, in terms of when this happened. So it was very traumatic for everyone, but especially for kids who were watching this in school, because, it was the first time a teacher had gone into space and all of that. And then obviously the folks at NASA that had worked on this that were, feeling so terrible. So he addresses all of those constituencies in one, and is able to do it in a specific and a conversational way, right? Feels less like a speech and more like a talk, as you were saying, in those kind of ways. And then the language, he didn't write the speech, but the language that was used, there's that one line in there, slip the surly bonds to touch the face of God. A beautiful line. But the other thing is that he could carry it off, right? You have to know when you're writing or you're constructing something, is it authentic to the voice of the speaker? What's going to work? Only you know what's natural for you to say and what will work for you. Obviously, the person writing this knew that Reagan could carry off a line like that. I can't really imagine Trump carrying off that line, think about it. So, you've got to be able to know who it is that you're writing for. If you're writing for yourself, you know what you feel comfortable saying. You know what is natural as far as your language. So not everybody can write like that, but also just the research and the history there. Looking up, somebody had to go and look up and very, effectively found that Sir Francis Drake analogy and figured out, looked in history and tried to find a historical reference to bring this all into perspective. And that was a brilliant decision on their part to talk about that voyage and use that analogy and compare this moment to that historical exploration. So, this wasn't just, and they didn't have a lot of time to do it either, because don't forget that happened in the morning and this is in the evening. So it's not like, there were just a few hours to go and prepare a new statement and go and research all of that.
Didn't ask Siri.
What?
She didn't ask Siri.
No, there was none of that, right. They couldn't exactly Google this day in history. Somebody actually had to go to a book, to a library. It's hard to believe actually when you think about it, because nowadays you can just look, this date, you can just say, I think it was January 28th or whatever it is, something like that, and look at all the dates in history the way we do now. Back then you actually had to go to a library, you had to go to a brick and mortar book, and you had to be able to find all that stuff. So, but there was some thought and some care and some research. It wasn't just an off-the-cuff improvisation of what to say.
Do you think they were behind him? He had those photographs. I
Yes.
forget the wedding. It was $1 on the left.
Yes.
Do you think they wouldn't address that desk for this?
Oh,
show?
absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely, yeah. It was all, and notice even the way the camera pulls in. There's somebody on that camera, moving the camera as he's speaking. That is well rehearsed and well orchestrated in terms of when they're going to zoom in. And this is a pool feed. So usually what happens in a case like this is one network will carry it live and then everybody will carry the feed. But my guess is in this particular circumstance that it was definitely rehearsed with that photographer to figure out when to slowly zoom and when to stop and at what point in the speech. Now, I don't know how much in advance, if there was probably not much any advance given the way it is now, to the media. But definitely that was scripted, that was rehearsed, and the camera angle's done as well. All to be able to have the proper tone to know when to stop and when to zoom in that particular way.
Hollywood.
Yeah, I mean really. So but it's not one of these things that just happens. There has to be some thought that's put into that, especially with a commemorative speech. In a way, I mean this was a eulogy, but it was also a pep talk for America. Not an easy task to mourn with the nation and then to say, yeah, but we're great and we're going to keep getting great. I mean, they're two, without it sounding crass or unfeeling or, but he could carry it off. He could carry it off. So, it's a mixture of speech writing and it's also a mixture of tone and figuring out, how to go about it. And there's got to be some authenticity there. And again, he's an actor, he was an actor, so he knew how to do it. But you've got to be able to know and have that innate sense of what's appropriate at a particular occasion and how people are going to feel about something. And even though he didn't have the audience right in front of him, it feels like even though he's talking to a camera, he's talking to each individual person in that audience. Notice even the mention of Nancy. Nancy and I are pain to the core. Mentioning her with it to give it that personal. That gives it the personal touch, just even mentioning, her name in that way. So figuring out, within those so much is done there within those 4 minutes of that speech.
I've never heard that phrase in my life, and I've heard a lot of folks talk about pain to the core. I've never heard it.
Yeah. I mean, and a lot of people couldn't carry that off. It would seem too much. It would seem disingenuous. But on him it works. On him it works. He knows how to deliver the line. So you got to be able to know what feels right to you, what feels natural, but also to take the time to think about the words and to do the research and to figure out, who your audience is, your demographic is, and how to put all that, how to pull all that together. Notice, he ends it kind of there rather than the usual way that a presidential address is, is used. So thinking about that and keeping that in mind. I mean, that's. It's great politics, it's great performance, it's also great speech writing. And again, he has the benefit of having had a team of people behind him. But it's something to think about and aspire to in terms of, there are moments where we're called upon to share words that people are kind of hanging on for hope or inspiration, or something else. So, because in a way there, he also had to, he had to persuade people to continue funding the program and persuade the international community that America was going to continue on and was still strong despite this. So not an easy task in terms of fulfilling all that, but definitely an effective one. So let's do a little exercise to finish off. Why don't we period even number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 8, 10, 11, 12. Well, you guys can be in a group of 3. So what I want you to do is I want you to interview your partner and ask them to describe either a success or failure in their life. All right, you can take notes if you want. And then you're going to switch, and the other person will be the interviewer, interviewee. And then you're going to come up here and you're going to summarize that anecdote. You're going to tell us about your partner's moment of success or failure. So you can divide up anyway.
Yeah.
So you know what I'll do? I'll let you know, start the interviewing, and then I'll let you know when to switch. You're going to ask about a moment of success or failure in there. And then you'll get the, and then you'll have to come up and retell it to that person.
And that guy, take that book.
Good job. And I think the ability to listen to people's stories and tell stories in the context of discussing and speech writing and presenting is going to be key. So, thinking about how to retell those stories succinctly, effectively, to bring in that pathos, to bring in that emotion is going to make your public speaking skills and your speech writing more effective. So, good luck. It was wonderful to meet you guys, and good luck in all your endeavors, and thank you for your service.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You did a great job.